She left in the middle of the night, so to speak. No trade. No injury. No farewell tour. One day, DeWanna Bonner was on the court in a Fever jersey, and the next she was just gone. The team called it personal reasons. The league moved on. The fans made up their own stories and argued about them for months. But almost a year later, the real reasons started leaking out piece by piece from people who were actually in the room. And when it finally came together, it explained a lot more than just one player walking away from one team. It explained a punch to the throat. It explained a suspension. It explained why two teams looked at each other like enemies every time they stepped on the same court. And at the center of all of it was one name: Caitlin Clark. Stay with me, because this story does not start with a fight. It starts with a celebration. To really understand how strange this whole saga is, you have to go back to a moment that looked like nothing but pure celebration. No shouting. No punches. No suspensions. Just a magazine cover for smiling faces and a franchise that thought it had just built something unstoppable. Nobody in that photo shoot had any idea what was actually brewing underneath the surface. And that's usually how these stories go, isn't it? The disaster never announces itself early. It hides behind the good news, behind the handshake, behind the smiling press conference, waiting for the right moment to show its face. Rewind to February of 2025. The Indiana Fever were the hottest story in women's basketball, and it wasn't just because of one rookie anymore. Caitlin Clark had already turned the franchise into a national headline the year before, selling out arenas that used to be half empty, pulling in television numbers nobody expected from a team that had been an afterthought for years. Now the front office wanted to build something real around her. They wanted a roster that could win, not just sell tickets. So they went shopping, and they landed one of the biggest names available on the free agent market: DeWanna Bonner. If you don't follow the league closely, you need to understand who Bonner actually was at that point, because this wasn't some fringe player chasing a paycheck. This was a 6-time All-Star, a 2-time WNBA champion, a forward who had been scoring buckets in this league since 2009, back when Caitlin Clark was still in elementary school. Bonner had already won titles with the Phoenix Mercury, the team that drafted her. She had spent years anchoring the Connecticut Sun, becoming one of the most reliable scorers in the entire league, night after night, season after season, long before most of the current Fever roster had even entered the league. She had been drafted all the way back in 2009, meaning by the time she put on an Indiana jersey, she had already lived through more than 15 years of professional basketball, multiple franchises, multiple coaching staffs, and an entire generation of teammates coming and going around her. She was, by almost any measure, one of the most accomplished players still active in the WNBA. Signing her wasn't just adding a role player. It was adding a proven winner, someone who had already lifted championship trophies, to a team that had talent but no championship pedigree of its own. Think about what that signing actually represented for a franchise like Indiana. For years, the Fever had been one of the league's quieter teams, rarely competing for titles, rarely landing the marquee free agents. Now, on the back of Caitlin Clark's arrival and the wave of attention she brought with her, they were suddenly able to attract a player like Bonner, someone who could have picked almost any contender in the league and chosen to sign there instead. That alone tells you how much the landscape around this franchise had shifted in just one offseason. Clark's presence wasn't just changing ticket sales and television ratings. It was changing who wanted to play alongside her. For Indiana, the timing felt perfect. The Fever already had Alyssa Thomas holding down the paint, a Rookie of the Year who was still growing into her prime. They had Kelsey Mitchell, a sharpshooting guard who had been the engine of that offense for years before Clark ever arrived. They brought in a brand new head coach, Stephanie White, tasked with turning a talented but chaotic roster into something that could actually compete in June instead of just May. And now they had Bonner too. On paper, it looked like the Fever had built a real contender around their franchise star. The city of Indianapolis was buzzing. Season ticket sales were through the roof. Sports Illustrated even put together a cover that spring, and it told you everything about how the league viewed this roster. Clark, Boston, Mitchell, and Bonner, 4 Fever players, side by side, smiling for the camera, presented as the new face of a franchise on the rise. That cover came out in May of 2025. It was supposed to be the beginning of something big. It was not. Because underneath that smiling magazine cover, something was already starting to crack. Bonner had been a starter for almost her entire career. She was used to touching the ball, running plays through her post-ups, being a focal point of whatever offense she played in. That is simply how a player builds their game after 16 years in the league. You don't just switch that off. But the Indiana Fever, by design, were building their offense around a different kind of player entirely. Caitlin Clark is what basketball people call a heliocentric player, which is just a fancy way of saying the entire offense revolves around her the way planets revolve around the sun. She brings the ball up. She runs the pick and roll. She's the one making the read on nearly every possession. That system had made the Fever must-watch television. It had also, according to people who later spoke about what happened behind the scenes, made it very difficult for a traditional post player like Bonner to feel like herself on the court. The warning signs showed up fast. By her fourth game in a Fever uniform, Bonner had already been pulled from the starting lineup. For games. That's it. A player with 6 All-Star selections to her name, benched before the month of May was even finished. If you were watching closely at the time, that alone should have told you something wasn't right. Teams don't usually bench a proven all-star that quickly unless there's a real problem, whether it's fit, chemistry, or something else entirely. But the Fever didn't offer much explanation. They just kept playing games and Bonner kept getting fewer and fewer minutes. Then, in the middle of June 2025, she disappeared completely. Not from the league. From the team. Bonner simply stepped away from the Indiana Fever, and the only explanation given to the public was 2 words: personal reasons. No further detail. No timeline for a return. She was gone for roughly 2 weeks, and during that stretch, the speculation online exploded. Was she injured? Was there a family emergency? Was this about basketball, or about something happening completely outside the sport? Reporters asked. The team stayed quiet. Bonner stayed quiet. And in that silence, rumors filled every gap, because that's what always happens when a superstar athlete vanishes without an explanation. People don't like unanswered questions, so they invent their own answers. Fans on social media picked the story apart from every possible angle. Some assumed it had to be a family matter, something private that deserved to stay private, and criticized anyone who dared to speculate further. Others were convinced it was purely about basketball, pointing back to that early benching as proof that something had gone wrong between Bonner and the coaching staff. A few even wondered out loud whether this had something to do with Alyssa Thomas, whose own team, the Connecticut Sun at the time, was in the middle of a rough stretch, and whether family logistics were pulling Bonner in a different direction. Sports talk shows debated it for days, without a single confirmed detail to work from. It became one of those strange sports mysteries where the silence itself became the story, bigger in some ways than any answer could have been. While she was away, word started to spread that Bonner had formally requested a trade out of Indiana. Not a leave of absence. Not a break to sort out something personal. An actual request to be sent somewhere else. That detail changed the entire conversation. If this really was just a private family matter, a trade request wouldn't usually be part of it. A trade request meant this was about basketball. It meant something inside that locker room, or inside that offense, had gone wrong enough that one of the most accomplished players in the league wanted out. The Fever tried to find a trade partner. According to reporting at the time, they worked to move her, to find another franchise willing to take on her contract and give both sides a clean break. But no deal came together. And so, at the end of June 2025, the Indiana Fever made a decision that shocked plenty of people around the league. They waived DeWanna Bonner outright. Not traded. Waived. A 6-time All-Star, a 2-time champion, brought in with so much fanfare just months earlier, was simply released, receiving no compensation in return. For a franchise that had been so careful about building its roster around its franchise player, cutting a proven winner loose for nothing was a stunning admission that something had gone very wrong, very fast. At the time, most of the public explanations stopped there. Personal reasons. A trade request. A release. The Fever didn't detail exactly what caused the breakdown, and Bonner, for her part, didn't spell it out either. When she eventually spoke to reporters that July, after signing elsewhere, she kept her comments focused on the positive. She talked about going home, about being somewhere familiar, about being around people she already knew and trusted. It was true, and it was also careful. Because here's the thing about DeWanna Bonner's career, there was an obvious next chapter waiting for her, and it had almost nothing to do with basketball strategy. Bonner's partner, the woman she is engaged to, is fellow WNBA veteran Alyssa Thomas. And that offseason, before the 2025 season even began, Thomas had been traded to the Phoenix Mercury, the exact team that had originally drafted Bonner back in 2009 and where she'd spent the first 11 years of her career. So when Indiana released her, Bonner didn't have to search far for her next home. She signed with Phoenix almost immediately, reuniting not just with the franchise where she started her career, but with her fiancé on the same roster. On the surface, it looked like a story with a clean, happy resolution. A brief, awkward stop in Indiana, and then a return to where she truly belonged, standing beside the person she loved. For a while, that's exactly how the story stayed. A strange blip in an otherwise legendary career. Bonner went back to Phoenix, laced up for the Mercury, and the Fever moved forward with the roster they had left. Caitlin Clark kept playing, kept drawing sellout crowds wherever she went, kept being the single biggest reason television ratings for women's basketball kept climbing to numbers nobody in the league had ever seen before. Nobody was talking much about DeWanna Bonner's 4 games as a Fever starter anymore. That chapter felt closed. Until the 2026 season, when the Fever and the Mercury were scheduled to play each other, and everything that had quietly built up over the past year came roaring back to the surface. Picture the scene. It's late June of 2026, just about a full year after Bonner had walked away from Indiana. The Fever and the Mercury are facing off, and DeWanna Bonner is standing across the court from the exact team and the exact star player she had once shared a locker room with. There was already a certain tension in the building before the ball was even tipped off, the kind of charged atmosphere that happens when a player returns to face the franchise that let them go, especially when the circumstances of that departure were never fully explained. Everyone in that arena, whether they knew the whole backstory or not, could feel that this wasn't just another regular season matchup. The building was packed, the way it usually is whenever Caitlin Clark's name is on the marquee. Cameras from national broadcasts were set up courtside. And somewhere in that crowd, plenty of fans were fully aware of the history sitting on the floor in front of them, the strange, unresolved exit from a year earlier, the unanswered questions that had never really gone away. It was the kind of night where you could sense, even before the opening tip, that one hard foul or one dirty look could set the whole thing off. Late in the game, with under 8 minutes left on the clock, it happened. Bonner and Clark got tangled up while jockeying for position on the floor, the kind of physical battle that happens dozens of times a game in this league, and usually gets called, whistled, and forgotten in seconds. But this one didn't get forgotten. A whistle blew, and Bonner ripped herself away from Clark, visibly frustrated. Clark followed after her. Words were exchanged, and within moments, players from both benches were pulled into the middle of it. By the time officials sorted through the chaos, 6 technical fouls had been handed out between the two teams, and Indiana's Myisha Hines-Allen had been ejected entirely after shoving Alyssa Thomas in the scramble. Clark herself picked up a technical foul in the confusion, her 5th of the season, for what officials ruled was taunting. After the game, Clark didn't hide her frustration with the call. She told reporters it felt ridiculous to get a technical simply for clapping in the middle of a scuffle that other people had started. That was June 22nd. If you thought the temperature couldn't rise any higher between these two teams, you were wrong. Because 2 nights later, on June 24th, the Fever and Mercury met again, and this time, what happened wasn't a shouting match or a shove. It was something that ended up making national news for reasons that went far beyond basketball. During a second quarter scramble for position, Alyssa Thomas caught Caitlin Clark with a closed fist, directly in the throat. Officials reviewed the play, and what had initially been ruled a lesser foul was upgraded after review to a flagrant 2, the most serious level of foul the league can assess on the spot, one that comes with an automatic ejection. The league office reviewed the incident afterward and handed Thomas a 1-game suspension. For a moment, an already tense rivalry between these two franchises had turned into something that felt almost violent, a moment replayed over and over across social media, sports shows, and highlight reels, with millions of people watching a punch land on the most famous player in the sport. What came next was ugly, and it happened fast. Online backlash toward Alyssa Thomas exploded almost instantly, with fans furious over what they'd seen happen to Clark. And in the middle of that storm, DeWanna Bonner stepped forward publicly to defend her fiancé. She posted a black and white photo of herself with Thomas on social media, with a caption making it clear she had Thomas's back no matter what, describing their bond as unbreakable. It was a small, personal gesture between two partners standing together during a difficult moment, and for some fans, it read as touching loyalty. But for others already furious about what had happened to Clark, that post became another target. Bonner found herself facing a wave of criticism and mockery online, trolled across social media for standing by Thomas after the incident. 2 days after the punch, on June 25th, the Mercury and Fever played yet again, and Phoenix came out on top in a wild game, 111-109, evening the season series between the two teams. Bonner spoke to reporters afterward, and rather than dwelling on the controversy, she talked about her team's resilience, about players stepping up while others were dealing with injuries, about the character it takes to stick together through adversity. On the surface, it sounded like a routine post-game interview. But given everything swirling around these two franchises at that moment, every word from Bonner was being read for a hidden meaning by fans and media alike. Then, on June 30th, the story took a turn that most people watching from the outside never saw coming. Bonner sat down with reporter Annie Costabile of The Athletic, and she revealed something that had nothing to do with the punch, nothing to do with Alyssa Thomas, and everything to do with her. Bonner said that she herself had been receiving threatening and abusive messages, not just in the days since the Thomas suspension, but going all the way back to when the Fever waived her, more than a year earlier in 2025. She described receiving nearly a dozen texts, direct messages, and social media comments sent not just to her, but to members of her family, through her personal accounts and even her private phone number. This wasn't public trolling that anyone scrolling through could stumble across. These were direct, targeted messages, arriving in her inbox and on her phone, and according to Bonner, they hadn't stopped in the year since she left Indiana. That detail changed the entire conversation happening around this rivalry. Because up until that point, most of the public narrative had been about Caitlin Clark facing criticism and abuse from opposing players, and about Alyssa Thomas facing backlash for what she did to Clark. Almost nobody outside Bonner's own circle knew that she had reportedly been dealing with her own wave of harassment, quietly, for over a year, tracing all the way back to those chaotic final weeks with the Fever. When that story came out, some fans and media members immediately asked a pointed question. Why hadn't this been reported before, especially when threats toward Clark had received so much coverage? Costabile addressed that criticism directly, explaining that she reports what she is actually shown or told, and that she had not personally received or verified any explicit threats sent to Clark, while the messages sent to Bonner had been shared with her directly and could be examined. In the middle of all this noise, Caitlin Clark herself finally spoke publicly, breaking her silence a few days after the incident. She confirmed she believed Thomas's contact with her throat had been a flagrant foul, but she made a point of drawing a much bigger circle around the conversation. She said that harassment and hate directed at any player were never acceptable, whether that player was on an opposing team, a teammate, or a coach. It was a notable moment, because rather than letting the story stay framed as simply Clark versus Thomas, or Fever versus Mercury, Clark used her platform to push back against the idea that any player, including someone like Bonner who had left her own team under difficult circumstances, deserved to be targeted online. So, by the start of July 2026, you had a genuinely strange situation on your hands. Two teams that clearly did not like each other. A suspended player, a star nursing both a sore throat and a mountain of media attention, and a departed former teammate who had just revealed she'd quietly been dealing with abuse for over a year. All of it circling back, again and again, to one central, unanswered question that had been sitting there since the summer of 2025. Why did DeWanna Bonner really leave the Indiana Fever? For nearly a full year, that question had just sat there, unanswered, gathering dust in the back of every conversation about the Fever's 2025 season. Reporters had asked, teammates had dodged. Bonner herself had kept her comments vague and diplomatic. It felt, at times, like the answer might simply never come, that this would join the long list of sports mysteries that never get fully solved, filed away next to every other athlete who quietly walked away from a team without explaining why. And that's when a WNBA analyst named Trista Crick finally said, out loud, what several people close to the situation had apparently been saying privately for a long time. Speaking on a Yahoo Sports broadcast just days before the Fever and Mercury were set to play yet again, Crick brought the conversation all the way back to that quiet, confusing exit from more than a year earlier. She reminded viewers that Bonner had left the Fever in the middle of the 2025 season, and that the public had never really been given a clear explanation why. Then she said that, according to people she had spoken with around the team, the real answer had been about Caitlin Clark the entire time. Crick explained that it came down to how heliocentric Clark's game is, meaning just how much the entire Fever offense was built to run through her, and how that reshaped the vibe of the whole team. She pointed out that, from what she understood, the rest of Clark's teammates loved playing alongside her. But Bonner, according to the sources Crick had spoken to, simply did not enjoy playing with her. And Crick suggested that this old, unresolved tension from 2025 was exactly what had been fueling the fire between these two teams ever since, elevating the temperature every single time the Fever and Mercury stepped onto the same court in 2026. Sit with that for a second, because if it's true, it reframes everything you just heard about this rivalry. The technical fouls, the ejection, the closed fist to the throat, the suspension, the harassment aimed at both Thomas and Bonner. All of it, according to this theory, traces its roots back to a simple, uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to say publicly back in 2025. That one of the greatest players of her generation joined a team built around Caitlin Clark and quietly decided she didn't want to be there anymore. Crick wasn't the only person connecting these dots either. Almost exactly a year earlier, back when Bonner had first left the Fever in June of 2025, a different journalist had floated her own theory about what was really going on. USA Today columnist Christine Brennan, who was working at the time on a book about Clark's impact on women's sports, appeared on a radio show and offered a slightly different, but related, explanation. Brennan suggested that Bonner simply hadn't been able to handle the sheer size of the spotlight that follows Caitlin Clark everywhere she goes. Brennan described that spotlight as white-hot, pointing out that being a teammate of Clark's came with massive opportunities, endorsement deals, appearances, attention, all of it overflowing onto teammates simply because Clark herself couldn't attend every single event or opportunity being offered to the team. According to Brennan's sources, instead of embracing that spotlight the way some of her teammates apparently did, Bonner struggled with it, and that struggle became part of why she wanted out. Two different journalists. Two slightly different explanations, but both of them landing on the same basic idea. That playing alongside Caitlin Clark, whether it was about her style of play on the court or the overwhelming fame that followed her off of it, was somehow too much for DeWanna Bonner to want to stick around for. Now, here's where I have to be honest with you, because a good story isn't worth much if it isn't also a true one. Neither of these explanations has ever been confirmed directly by Bonner herself or by the Indiana Fever organization. These are theories, built on unnamed sources, offered by media members who cover this league closely and clearly have relationships with people inside these locker rooms. That doesn't mean they're wrong. Reporters build careers on cultivating exactly those kinds of relationships, and both Crick and Brennan have been covering this league long enough to have real credibility. But it also doesn't mean this is settled fact. Bonner has never stood in front of a camera and said, in her own words, "I left because of Caitlin Clark." What she has said publicly has mostly focused on the positive, on going home, on being back where she started. And there's a detail that makes this whole theory even stranger if you slow down and actually look at the timeline. Bonner and Clark barely played together at all. Bonner was pulled from the starting lineup by her fourth game. She stepped away from the team completely by the middle of June. All told, reporting suggests the two of them shared the floor as teammates for somewhere around 4 to 9 games total, a tiny fraction of a full WNBA season, and during part of that stretch, Clark herself was even sidelined with an injury. So the question becomes, How much tension can genuinely build up between two teammates in such a short window of actual shared playing time? Is it really possible that just a handful of games together created enough friction to explain a year and a half of hostility between two franchises? Or is there something bigger going on here, something about locker room culture or team fit, or simply the pressure of playing in the most scrutinized environment in the entire league, that these theories are only partially capturing? That confusion hasn't gone unnoticed by people covering the story either. Even the outlets reporting on Crick's comments admitted the whole situation felt bewildering when you actually crunch the numbers on how little time these two players spent on the floor together. It's a genuinely strange piece of this puzzle, and it's part of why, even now, with all of these theories floating around, nobody can say with complete certainty that they've found the full, real reason DeWanna Bonner walked away from the Indiana Fever. What we do know is what happened after. And what happened after tells its own story, even if the original cause stays a little blurry. We know that once Bonner landed back in Phoenix, reunited with Alyssa Thomas, the two of them became one of the most talked about pairings in the league, not just because of their history together, but because of how fiercely protective they clearly are of one another. That black and white photo Bonner posted defending Thomas after the suspension wasn't a calculated PR move. It read like two people who have been through a lot together, standing shoulder to shoulder in public the same way they apparently do in private. We know that the rivalry between the Fever and the Mercury became one of the most physical, most emotionally charged matchups anywhere in the league during the 2026 season, spilling out into technical fouls, ejections, flagrant fouls, and enough public drama to keep sports talk shows busy for weeks. Other players got pulled into the storyline too. Fever guard Sophie Cunningham became a lightning rod of her own, publicly accusing opposing teams of targeting Clark on the floor and criticizing the league for not doing enough to protect her, while also mocking Bonner over a viral moment between the two of them during one of these games. The temperature around this rivalry didn't just stay hot, it kept climbing month after month. And we know that somewhere in the middle of all that noise, two women, Caitlin Clark and DeWanna Bonner, both ended up targets of online abuse that neither of them deserved. Clark, for being the most famous player in the sport, drawing outsized attention, both good and bad, wherever she goes. And Bonner, quietly, away from most of the headlines, for over a year, simply for the way she left a team that so many people had wanted her to succeed on. Maybe the truth is that this story was never really about one single clean reason. Maybe it's not simply that Caitlin Clark, as a person or a player, drove Bonner out of Indiana. Maybe it's about what happens when you build an entire franchise, an entire offense, an entire media spotlight around one enormous star, and then ask a proven veteran with her own legacy, her own history of stardom, her own way of playing the game, to fold herself into a supporting role inside that spotlight. Maybe some players thrive in that environment, the way Clark's other teammates reportedly have. And maybe some players, no matter how talented, no matter how accomplished, simply don't want to live inside somebody else's orbit, even for a single season. We may never get the full, detailed, on-the-record explanation from DeWanna Bonner herself about exactly what happened during those chaotic few weeks in the summer of 2025. She has never fully explained it, and given how private she has chosen to keep this particular chapter of her career so far, she may never choose to. But what we do know is this. A short, quiet exit from one franchise, wrapped in nothing but two vague words, personal reasons, somehow grew into one of the most talked about, most physical, and most emotionally raw rivalries in the entire WNBA. A punch to the throat. A suspension. Threats sent to two different players for two very different reasons. And a question that keeps circling back to where it all started. Was Caitlin Clark really the reason DeWanna Bonner left the Indiana Fever? The people closest to that locker room seem to think so. Bonner herself has never confirmed it. And somewhere between those two positions is the messy, complicated, deeply human truth of what actually happens when a legendary veteran and a generational young superstar end up sharing the same small patch of hardwood, and it turns out there isn't quite enough room there for both of them. Think back for a moment to that Sports Illustrated cover from May of 2025. For players, one franchise, one shared smile for the camera. At the time, it was supposed to symbolize everything the Indiana Fever were building toward: a young superstar, a steady veteran center, a sharpshooting guard who had been there through the lean years, and a legendary forward brought in to push them over the top. Nobody looking at that photo could have guessed that within a matter of weeks, one of those four smiling faces would be gone, released outright, with barely a word of public explanation. And nobody could have guessed that a year later, that same quiet departure would somehow be tangled up in a closed fist to the throat, a league suspension, and threats sent to two different women for two completely different reasons. That's the story, at least the story as we know it right now. But if this rivalry has taught us anything over the past year, it's that this particular chapter is far from finished. Every time these two teams meet again, there's a real chance we learn one more piece of what actually happened behind those closed locker room doors back in 2025. And when that next piece comes out, you can bet it will be just as complicated, just as human, and just as impossible to look away from as everything that came before it.